You've heard this one before. Somebody says it like it's an established fact of the universe. When the bombs finally drop, the cockroaches will be the ones left standing. It gets repeated so often that nobody questions it anymore. It's treated as biology's punchline, the one insect too stubborn for humanity's worst weapon to finish off. Here's the problem. It's not really true. Not in the way you've been told. And the actual science underneath this myth is far stranger and far more interesting than the myth itself. Because if a nuclear weapon detonated close enough to you to matter, the cockroach in the wall next to you would die at almost exactly the same moment you did. Not from radiation, from heat. A nuclear detonation produces temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun for a fraction of a second, followed by a shock wave that levels buildings for miles. Neither of those things care what species you are. Concrete, steel, insects, humans, the blast and the heat make no distinction. So the very first thing to understand is this. Cockroaches were never going to survive standing next to the bomb. Nobody was. That part of the myth is simply wrong. So where did this idea even come from? It traces back partly to Hiroshima, where cockroaches were reportedly seen scuttling through the wreckage in the days after the bombing. But those insects weren't at the center of the blast. They were at the edges, far enough from ground zero that the heat and shock wave hadn't reached lethal intensity, in a zone where radiation, not fire, was the primary danger left behind. And that distinction, radiation versus blast, is where the real story actually lives. Because radiation resistance is a real thing. Cockroaches genuinely do have more of it than you do. The myth isn't built on nothing. It's just built on the wrong picture, the wrong danger, at the wrong distance, for the wrong reason. It's worth pausing here, because most people conflate two completely different threats when they picture a nuclear weapon. There's the blast itself, heat and pressure, over almost instantly, indifferent to biology, entirely. And then there's what's left behind, invisible, lingering, seeping into soil and water and dust for weeks or years afterward. The myth about cockroaches was never really about the first threat. It only makes any sense at all when you're talking about the second one. Radiation that lingers long after the fire and the shockwave have already done their damage and moved on. To understand why, you need to understand what radiation actually does to a living body. It's not heat, and it's not some vague general damage. Ionizing radiation works by tearing through DNA, snapping the strands inside your cells. Every cell in your body has this molecule, and every cell needs an intact copy of it to function. Normally, damaged DNA gets repaired constantly, in the background, without you ever noticing. But there's one moment where a cell is catastrophically exposed to this kind of damage. Right when it's dividing. Mid-division, DNA is unwound, unprotected, and actively being copied. A cell caught in that state when radiation passes through is far more likely to end up with damage so severe it simply fails, or worse, starts replicating with corrupted instructions. This single fact explains almost everything else in this story. Think about which parts of your body divide the fastest. Your bone marrow, manufacturing new blood cells every single day, without pause, for your entire life. The lining of your gut, which replaces itself every few days because it's constantly being worn down by digestion. These tissues are exactly the places radiation sickness hits first and hardest, because these are exactly the tissues where cells are dividing constantly, exposed, vulnerable, around the clock. The very systems that keep you alive under normal circumstances, a body that heals, renews, and constantly replaces itself, become the precise systems a burst of radiation is most equipped to destroy. That's the cruel irony sitting at the center of radiation sickness. Complexity and renewal, the things that make you a resilient, self-repairing organism day to day, are the same things that make you fragile the moment radiation enters the picture. So what's the actual number? For a human, a dose of around 4 to 4.5 grays is enough to kill half the people exposed to it within a month. Cross into the range of 10 grays, and it becomes fatal for essentially everyone, regardless of treatment. That's the wall for us. It's a shockingly small number, physically speaking. A few grays, delivered all at once, and your body's fastest renewing systems collapse faster than they can be replaced. Doctors can treat the symptoms, transfusions, isolation, antibiotics for the infections that flood in once your immune system stops being replenished. But none of that changes the fundamental math. Once enough of your bone marrow's dividing cells are wiped out at once, there's no factory left to rebuild the workforce. Now, here's where the cockroach comes back in. Cockroaches can withstand doses in the range of 100 grays. That's roughly 10 to 20 times the human lethal threshold. And the reason has nothing to do with some kind of armored, indestructible biology. It comes down to that same mechanism, cell division timing, just tilted dramatically in their favor. A cockroach's cells don't divide constantly the way ours do. They divide mainly around molting, and a cockroach molts only about once a week. That means at any random moment, only a small fraction of a cockroach's cells are caught in that vulnerable dividing state. Radiation sweeps through, and it simply has far fewer exposed targets to hit. It's not that cockroach cells resist damage better than yours. It's that most of them, at any given instant, aren't in the one state where that damage actually matters. But here's the part of this story that the popular myth completely leaves out. Cockroaches aren't even close to the ceiling of what's possible here. Fruit flies, of all things, can withstand higher radiation doses than cockroaches, for essentially the same reason, taken even further. Tardigrades, the microscopic, near-indestructible creatures, famous for surviving the vacuum of space, have a lethal radiation threshold, estimated around 4,200 grays. That's roughly 1,000 times what would kill you. And the true record holder isn't an animal at all. It's a bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans, nicknamed, only half-jokingly, Conan the bacterium. It can absorb an acute dose of 5,000 grays with almost no drop in survival. Push it to 12,000 grays, and roughly 1 in 10 of its cells is still alive afterward. Its trick isn't avoidance, like the cockroaches, it's repair. This bacterium keeps multiple redundant copies of its own genome, and when radiation shreds its DNA into fragments, it can physically reassemble the pieces back into a working genome. Like solving a puzzle, it's been shattered into 1,000 times before, and it treats each shattering as routine. So the cockroach isn't the final boss of nuclear apocalypse survival. It's not even in the top 3. It's simply the one that ended up as a cultural mascot, probably because it's the creature most people already associate with being impossible to get rid of. Which brings us back to you, and why none of this works in your favor. Your body is a marvel of constant renewal, skin replacing itself, blood cells manufactured by the billions daily, a gut lining that rebuilds itself faster than almost any other tissue you have. That system is what allows you to heal from cuts, recover from illness, and function as a complex organism for decades. But it's also a system built almost entirely around cells that divide, and divide often. Exactly the condition that makes a cell vulnerable to radiation. Exactly the condition a cockroach mostly avoids through simple biological timing, and one that Deinococcus radiodurans has turned into a non-issue through relentless repair. You don't get either advantage. Your complexity, the very thing that makes you resilient in almost every other circumstance life throws at you, is the specific thing that leaves you exposed here. It's not a design flaw. It's just a trade-off nobody negotiated for, one biology settled on long before nuclear physics ever entered the picture. So the next time somebody repeats the line about cockroaches inheriting the earth, you'll know the fuller version of that story. They wouldn't survive standing next to the blast, same as you. Their real advantage only shows up afterward, in the fallout, and even then, they're not the ones who'd actually walk away the least damaged. That title belongs to a fruit fly, a tardigrade, and ultimately, a bacterium most people have never heard of, quietly reassembling its own shattered genome like it's nothing. Cockroaches didn't win the apocalypse. They just got the best publicity.